My name is Elizabeth Murray, as you know, and I'm a Senior Program Officer at USIP. At USIP, my work focuses on Sudan, Central African Republic, and the Sahel region of Africa. But I've been with USIP for 12 years, so I've had the great fortune of working on a variety of projects in Sub-Saharan Africa, where I'm focused now, and also in Latin America at the beginning of my career at USIP. Today, I'm going to be speaking with you on the role of arts in peace in Sudan and Central African Republic. And the two examples that I'm going to share with you today are very different from one another. So I hope that they can help us to think broadly about the role of arts in peace and that we can then have a rich conversation during the Q&A. In Sudan, arts played a role in fueling a nonviolent revolution that culminated in the overthrow of longtime dictator Omar al-Bashir. So this is an example of how arts can contribute to change at the national level. In the Central African Republic, which I will refer to by its abbreviation CAR, I'm going to be sharing about how USIP incorporated arts into its dialogue program in 4 communities. While the Sudan case is about how arts can fuel change at the national level, the CAR case is more about how arts can be used in local level peace building. So let's begin with Sudan. To give a little bit of context, Sudan is a large country in northeastern Africa, a population of 42 million. The capital city is fairly cosmopolitan, the capital city of Khartoum, I should say, with several strong universities and a solid private sector. At the same time, many of Sudan's citizens live in poverty, and this is particularly acute outside of the capital region. Sudan also has a history of government repression and state-sponsored violence against its citizens. It was ruled by dictator Omar al-Bashir for nearly 30 years. He came to power in 1989, and Bashir used repression to keep his political opponents at bay. Under his rule, the government would routinely detain, arrest, and even torture activists and political opposition figures. And the Bashir regime also waged war against people in the peripheral or outlying regions of the country. The regime was responsible for much of the violence that killed more than 200,000 people in Darfur in the early 2000s. And Bashir's government was notoriously corrupt. So during his rule, the government's resources were used to enrich a very small group of people, mostly those that were close to the president from the Nile River Valley in the center of the country. But this enriching of a select set of people, the elite from the Nile River Basin, came at the expense of the development of the rest of the country, which fueled a lot of grievances, as you could imagine. So over the course of Bashir's rule, there were many grievances, as I've articulated, and there had been several rounds of protests, but these never really took off because the government was so skilled at repression that they would quickly crack down and end the protests. But in late 2018, things were different. The protests did take off. They were much better organized, and they got too big and too strong for the government to easily repress. Protests began in the northern city of Atbara over high prices and other economic problems. And people were protesting living conditions, but at the same time, it was a protest against the government that people felt was responsible for these conditions. So the nonviolent movement gathered momentum, spread across the country with a variety of tactics, sit-ins, marches, boycotts, and other forms of protest. And the most famous of these, and the one that you may have seen in news coverage or your research about Sudan, was the massive sit-in at the military headquarters in the capital city of Khartoum. Tens of thousands of people sat in this square in front of the military headquarters 24 hours a day for weeks on end. And it was, I think, a really, really powerful symbol of these scores of people protesting peacefully in front of the building that housed one of the main arms of repression of the government that had been used to commit violence against citizens. And after a short time, the protests had evolved from, as I explained, they were originally about economic conditions, but they evolved into an explicit demand for the removal of Omar al-Bashir. The protests were organized by a group called the Sudanese Professionals Association. And I think it's important to note that traditional political parties are not very well regarded in Sudan. So they hadn't been able to organize protests very effectively in the past because people just didn't really trust the political parties. But in contrast, the Sudanese Professionals Association, which is a grouping of the Doctors Association and the Lawyers Association and the Teachers Association and other groups of different professions, they were really able to garner people's trust. And bring a large cross-section of people to the demonstrations, which is critical for the success of any nonviolent movement, as you know. So what role did art play? As the protests ramped up around the country, you saw an absolute explosion of art and creativity: song, graffiti, poetry, dance, virtual art, you name it. And this was really drawing on Sudan's rich arts tradition. So Sudanese art is a mix of Arab and African styles, and it's very unique. And Sudan is also the birthplace of what is known as the Cartoon School. Some of the artists on the call, I'm sure you know this. The Cartoon School is a modernist art movement that was founded in Sudan and is actually one of Africa's most famous art movements. But in spite of this rich tradition, artists had been repressed over many years, and political art had been particularly discouraged. And so as a consequence of this repression and the terrible economy, it was really hard to make a living as an artist in Sudan, and the art scene was sort of weak and underground for a number of years. But this really started to change in 2019, because as the protests that I just described, as they grew, this started to open up space for artists who had long been repressed to go public with their work. And I sometimes explain this as sort of a virtuous cycle. So because the protests were growing and getting stronger, the government was sort of losing its ability to repress. It was losing its grip on repression. And so the space was cracked open slightly for free expression. And then at the same time, when the artists were able to begin to create, to do art, to do poetry, to do song in the space, that sort of helped to further pry open the space for more free expression. And so it went until you just had a massive amount of art that was part of the revolution and a much broader acceptance of the role of art in public life. And there were so many different mediums of art that were part of the revolution. Some of the most famous art was graffiti. And this was graffiti that was graffiti or murals, however you want to call it. And this was not just used to call out the Bashir regime for all of its violence, but it was also used to really encapsulate visually what the movement was for. So not just what people were against, but what they wanted to see in their future. Beyond graffiti art, you had so much singing, so many poetry recitations at the sit-in over the many hours and days of protests. You had art on canvas. There's a beautiful artwork that was part of the flyer for this movement. That art and many others captured some of the most iconic moments during the revolution. And something that was really innovative during the revolution was the use of virtual art. So art that was created specifically for consumption online. Many people in the Sudanese diaspora were not able to come back to the country during the revolution as much as they wanted to, because travel was difficult or dangerous. And some of the artists described to me feeling helpless when their family members and their friends were on the streets 24 hours a day, protesting, facing dangerous conditions. They really wanted to do something to help. So a lot of people created art specifically for use on Facebook or Instagram to draw attention to what was happening in Sudan, to the demands of the protesters, to some of the repression that they were experiencing. And this was particularly useful after a really violent crackdown on the protests in June of 2019. Members of the diaspora created the Blue for Sudan hashtag, encouraging people on Instagram and Facebook to change their profiles blue in support of the Sudanese protesters. And one of the most innovative works of virtual art that I saw from Sudan was made by a member of the diaspora, a man named Mergani Salih, who was living in Dubai at the time and wanted to highlight the role of women in the revolution. So in spite of women being discouraged from playing strong roles in public life in many ways during the Bashir regime, women really stepped up and played a tremendous role in the revolution. And Mirghani wanted to honor this. So he created a photo mosaic of an iconic portrait of a traditional Sudanese grandmother. And he says that the Sudanese grandmother conveys respect and authority. And so he created a mosaic of this image by using photos of women who were leaders in the revolution. And if it's hard to explain, it's because it's extremely complex. So I'd love it if we could show the video right now. It's just a 2-minute video, and I think you'd really enjoy seeing it.
بنفس قوة بطشهم بالأبرياء بطشوا بمن سرق الرغيف من الجياع أو ليتهم وبنفس نهمتهم على سفك الدماء استرجعوا شبرا من الوطن المضاع لكنهم ولبؤسهم هم نفسهم لكنهم ولبؤسهم هم نفسهم من أورد الناس المهالك والمذلة بالخداع
So I hope that you enjoyed that. I think that Mirghani is just an absolute genius, how he was able to amass that database of photographs and then sort of overlay them to create this famous image. There's in the article that I wrote for USIP about the role of arts in Sudan, there are a few other videos. If you're interested in that sort of interactive videos, I'd encourage you to click through the article. When I think about what art accomplished in the revolution, I think of a few key things. I think that art helped to spur conversations about the trajectory of the country. So what was wrong, the abuses, bringing the abuses to light, and what was desired for the future. And an example of this is the work of the graffiti artist Assil Diab, who is known by the artist name Pseudolove. Assil Diab was a member of the diaspora. She was, I think, she was somewhere in the Gulf at the time, and she returned to Sudan during the revolution, and she started a massive public art project of creating murals to memorialize what are known as the martyrs of the revolution. So those protesters that were killed by security services and also people who had been killed by the previous regime. So Asil would go to the homes of the people who had been killed, the martyrs, and talk to their families and make sure that they were okay, that they wanted a mural of their loved ones outside of their gates on the walls that often border between the homes and the street in Khartoum. And people were really enthusiastic about memorializing their loved ones in these ways. And Asil would invite, she's the artist, but she would invite the participation of the family members to help her paint, to help her draw outlines, to help her make sure she depicted the faces of their loved ones in the right way. And so I think that was, she has described to me that was a really healing experience for the people who were grieving, who were able to participate with her. And the artwork was so large. So these would be 6 or 7 foot tall portraits, just facial portraits of people. So she has said to me that when you walk out onto the street and you see the sort of massive faces of people who were killed during the revolution, she said, whether you're for or against the revolution, you're forced to be reminded of what's going on and to think about it and to sort of decide what your position is on what's going on. So it was a way of really forcing people to think and engage with what was happening around them. I also think that public art can be a call to action. So some of the most popular slogans of the revolution were painted in graffiti around the sit-in and elsewhere in Sudan. And I think that helped to mobilize people around key goals and messages. And then for the song and the poetry and the chanting at the sit-in, I think this really helped to fortify people after long days of protests when they were facing incredible danger. This helped people face their fears and gather strength for more and more days of protests. And then the last thing that I'll mention is that art actually had a really practical role in the revolution, because when the internet was shut down, as the government did at several points during the revolution, artists would go out, paint simple murals, and actually put the time and date of the next protest as part of the mural. So it was a way to convey to people that, please show up at this corner at this time on this day, when it was quite literally impossible to communicate with people in other ways, like through Facebook or WhatsApp or all the other tools that are usually used to organize protests. So that's a bit about the role of art. And maybe you're wondering, how did this end? What happened in Sudan? Omar al-Bashir was removed in April 2019, but he was replaced by a military junta. So for the protesters, this was not enough. This wasn't what they wanted. They were looking for a transition to civilian rule. And they decided to keep the pressure on under the leadership of the Sudanese Professionals Association and a coalition of other organizations known as the Forces for Freedom and Change. So they kept up the sit-in, asking for a transition to civilian rule. But there was as I mentioned, a very violent crackdown on the sit-in in June 2019 that was carried out by people who were loyal to the previous regime. And this resulted in the terrible deaths of more than 100 protesters. After that, the Forces for Freedom and Change, the Sudanese Professionals Association, they shifted to some different tactics, including boycotts, but they did manage to keep the pressure on. And in August 2019, there was finally an agreement that set out a 39-month period of power sharing, during which the government would be jointly managed by the military and civilians. And this was the transition period to full civilian rule. So the revolution had succeeded in its goals. It's been hailed by a senior UN official as one of the greatest nonviolent movements of our time. And it is absolutely something to celebrate, and the role of art is something to celebrate as well. At the same time, Sudan's still in a precarious position. It's early in its transition, and there are many challenges. And I think there's still a role for art at this time, which we can discuss more in the Q&A if you're interested.